Hello there, welcome to Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And thank you so much for all your encouraging support. I value each and every one of you so much and love to you all. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, how can I ever forget the day when I woke up with a heavy, bodeful feeling in my heart? In truth, I have never experienced such a cryptic, indecipherable feeling like that before. It is hard to describe, impossible to put into words. It was like an inauspicious sense of disquietude that clung to me ominously, like a barnacle to the hull of a boat, as if I had an impending but doomful sense that something very bad was about to happen, or may possibly have already transpired. I couldn't decide which. I have often wondered if many people who never turned up to the Twin Towers that inauspicious day had a similar sense of percussive prognostication. It was like a prophetic lighthouse in your brain had switched on its light, warning you that something was distinctly off kilter. Something was seriously off. Let's just say it ironed away any desire for me to follow my normal daily routines. I remember reluctantly climbing out of bed as the blazing, obtrusive sunshine was unabashedly trespassing through the corners of my bedroom curtains that I had been meaning to replace for a long time with a powerful block-out fabric. There is nothing worse than waking up to find the sun infiltrating your closed eyes when you're trying to sleep. I noticed my husband's side of the bed was empty, long since abandoned. He had left for work a while ago. I had a vague recollection of hearing the shower going from our ensuite bathroom. My husband had kissed me tenderly on the cheek, as he always did, before he left for work. I remember smelling the strong, reassuring fragrance of his musky aftershave. I think when he said, "Goodbye, darling. Have a great day. I'll see you later," I had mumbled something under my breath. But in my languid state, I was caught between two worlds. It was a Wednesday morning, and on Wednesdays I could sleep in, as my 12-year-old daughter Kendall was picked up from school by Mrs. van Hoekstraten, who ran the lift club with the efficiency of a very organised, reliable headmistress. I reluctantly climbed out of bed, noticing that my legs were weighed down by our heavy Maine Coon cat, Sainsbury, that weighed much more than a small dog. She was easily over 8 kilos in weight. Sainsbury didn't look best pleased when I untangled my bare feet from the knotted-up bed sheets and climbed out of bed, jolting him out of position. He let out a disapproving yowl and continued to lackadaisically stretch out his long paws, close his eyes, and drift off dozily to La-La Land. I knew he would lie there all day, which was the quintessential excuse not to make my queen-size bed, as disturbing Sainsbury would be unthinkable. I knew the moment the evening broke, Sainsbury would be gingerly out, painting the night red with his sprightly nocturnal activities that I would rarely rather not know about, as I am sure they were grossly macabre, like biting off a head of a cricket or dismembering a frog. On many occasions he returned home with small rodents that he left for me at the foot of my bed as gifts, which would make me scream in horrified disgust when I accidentally picked up from the floor what I thought was a rolled-up sock, only to find it was half a butchered rat, missing its tail. I glanced at the clock. It was already 10:30 in the morning. I was supposed to be meeting my friends at the club for tennis. You'd think that I'd rush to my closet, throw on my tennis clothes, and be out of the door faster than a jackrabbit. But I limped awkwardly towards my cupboard, like a one-legged man, staring vacantly at my tennis clothes, with the enthusiasm an orca might have when facing a sea cucumber, if that ever happens. I stood there gormlessly, not budging an inch, like someone who quite literally had lost all sense of my bearings, as if I was disorientated and confused at the chaotic sense of foreboding that hung over my mind, like a tight, suffocating choker chain of pearls around a lady's neck. What the hell was wrong with me? Why did I feel so wretchedly uneasy? I could taste a bitter, repungent, bile-like flavour coming from the back of my throat, and I felt governed by a sluggish, lethargic lack of eagerness to get my day started, which was most uncharacteristic for me. The house seemed so unnaturally quiet that morning. I pulled back the curtains in my bedroom rather soberly. They overlooked the street of our tree-lined, bustling neighbourhood, where we lived in Bella Vista in Philadelphia. Bella Vista is well known for its Italian open market on 9th Street, and foodies congregate to our neighbourhood with an eager enthusiasm, as there are fabulous bakeries, grocery stores and restaurants on offer, boasting Asian, Mexican and Italian food. And there are also stunning coffee shops and parks in the area. I noticed the street was rather quiet, except for a young woman who was walking her small Yorkie down the pavement. I reached for my cell phone and sent a text to my friends. "Sorry, I can't make tennis this morning. Something's come up." It was true in a way, as what had come up was an incongruous feeling that kept abruptly disturbing my sense of peace. I couldn't shake it off like a tick on a shaggy dog's coat. I realised I was rather hungry. Some fresh air and exercise was well in order. Maybe my heavy sense of trepidation would leave me, after indulging my stomach with something a lot more substantial than just a mere beverage. I decided to amble down the street to my favourite coffee bar. Hopefully the caffeine would iron away the foggy fuzz that blistered my mind. I managed to put on a pair of ugly sweats and a loose baggy t-shirt. It was a beautiful sunny morning in early spring, with the sycamore trees blowing gently in a cool breeze, caressing my skin with their fresh nudges. The crowns of green leaves looked glorious on this morning, while their white sculptural boughs were easy on the eyes. I failed to appreciate, of course, the vibrant scenery, and the window boxes of people's houses ablaze with hanging red geraniums. The cafe was buzzing with spirited people as usual, all eager to grab a coffee, so I stood patiently in line, waiting until I received mine. I chose an ice blonde cafe Americana, along with a date and walnut muffin. I went to sit in a very private corner of the coffee shop, away from the glare of the spotlight, so I could bask in my lugubrious melancholia that had accompanied me all the way to the coffee shop like an unwelcome friend. "Do you mind if I join you?" said a young woman, pulling out a chair and sitting down opposite me. "If you don't mind my saying, you look like you could do with a friend. I noticed you entering the coffee shop with a deflated, hangdog expression on your face. Tell me to mind my own business, but you know what they say, a problem shared is a problem halved. I'm a great listener, so I'm told, although my husband would probably disagree. He tirelessly complains that I talk far too much. My name's Judy, by the way, and you are?" "I'm Carly," I said. The young woman was so warm and friendly, so I guess I just opened up to her. She was quite bohemian, wearing a pretty retro dress and some combat boots, so that her masculine boots made her pretty dress all the more feminine. She was wearing a velvety headband on her long dark hair. She was significantly younger than I was, easily in her 20s, while I was in my late 40s, but the age gap was no hindrance to either of us, as I think we instantly warmed to each other. It's ironic, when a stranger may cross your path, that you may never ever see again, but they leave behind an indelible impression. That was what this stranger was like for me. "I can't believe that I look so obviously down," I told her. "I don't really know what the matter is with me," I confided. "I've experienced a heavy sense of foreboding all morning that I just can't shake off, try as I might," I said, sipping my cafe Americana slowly, allowing the ice drink to soothe my hot frustration. "Something has just been niggling me, like an itch on your body you just can't locate, that you desperately, desperately need to scratch, if you know what I'm talking about." "Well, I think that's your gut instinct telling you something is wrong," said Julie nonchalantly. "Do you know that's your body preparing you for bad news? It happened to me before," she said, taking a casual sip of her own drink. She almost looked apologetic when my face registered alarm at her comments. "Oh, forgive me. I didn't mean to scare you like this, because what you're feeling is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't know how to put it, actually, but it's like an inward compass that you have. I remember when my dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer a while back. I had this ominous feeling about him that I couldn't shake off. I begged him to go and get a checkup at the doctor. I had a sense something was very wrong with him. Luckily, my father listened to me. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer, but it was caught so early, and now he's cancer-free." She paused for a moment and said, "It's very important to listen to your gut instincts. Sometimes they help us." "Well," I said, I have no idea what mine are telling me. It's like a heavy cloud hanging over me. At least with you, you knew your sense of foreboding was connected to your father. But mine is a profound sense that something is intrinsically wrong, but it would certainly help a whole lot if I actually knew what it was. It's a mystery that is simply killing me right now. At that precise moment, I nearly jumped out of my skin. When my cell phone disturbed the silence with its loud ringtone, I glanced at the caller ID. It was my daughter's cell phone. Kendall never phoned me at this time of the morning. My hackles began to rise. Was my daughter in trouble? "Is everything all right?" asked Judy. "You've gone as white as a sheet. Hadn't you better answer the call?" "It's my daughter," I told her, my heart pounding in my chest a dime to a dozen. "I hope to God nothing's wrong with her. She never phones me at this time." I was unable to disguise the anguished tone of my voice. I hurriedly answered the call. "Is everything all right, darling?" I asked my daughter. "Not really. I don't feel great, Mum. Mrs. Allister says you can pick me up to take me home." "There you go," said Julie, smiling triumphantly. "Your sense of perturbation was about your daughter. You can relax now. I'm sure she's going to be all right." "You're so sweet, Judy. It was really good to meet you," I said, rushing past her, giving her a pat on her back, and running as fast as I could out of the coffee shop, onto the street, to get home as fast as I could, so that I could finally get into my car and quickly drive to my daughter's school. In a strange way, I felt relief wash over me when I collected my daughter from school. She appeared to be in one piece, which is always reassuring for any mother. She was sitting on the concrete wraparound seat under a black walnut tree, waiting for me, with her face buried in her hands. She did look like a sorry sight, but she was not going to die. I could see that at once. I thought the heavy feeling I harboured in my gut had obviously concerned her. She was going to be fine, so I'd simply worried about absolutely nothing, I assured myself. My daughter must have heard my truck drawing up to her, because she looked up at me, and I noticed her eyes brightened for a brief second. She was so pleased to see me, as I was to see her. I climbed out of my truck. She ran towards me, throwing her arms around me, as if we hadn't seen each other for an age. I held her tightly in my arms for a moment. If my husband and my daughter were all right, I could deal with almost anything that life threw at me. Kendall seemed unusually clingy that morning, as if she was in urgent need of reassurance. I looked down at her earnest but troubled eyes. "You're not feeling well, are you, sweetheart?" She nodded. "I feel horrible, Mummy." I directed her to the car. She sank into the leather seat so gratefully, releasing a huge sigh, like an overinflated beach ball that has been punctured slightly so it can liberate itself from some of that tight air pressure. "Why aren't you feeling well, darling?" I asked her. "It's most unlike you to be sick. Why, you were only boasting the other day that you haven't had a sick day in 2 years." "It's a funny kind of sickness," my daughter told me. "It's not in my body, it's in my head. It won't go away," she said, holding her head. "You have a headache?" I asked her. "That's strange. It's most unlike you to get headaches." She shook her head fiercely. "You don't understand, Mum. It's nothing like that. I'm not upset about that. I haven't got a headache. It's 'cause Granny Alice came to visit me last night. She told me she loved me and she was going away and was coming to say goodbye. She said I must be good. It just made me upset, that's all. I don't want Granny Alice to go away. When I was at school, it was all I could think about. Why does Granny Alice have to go away, Mummy?" I looked at my daughter, nonplussed. "But Granny Alice is fine. She's not going anywhere," I said, trembling for a moment, trying to smile reassuringly at my daughter. But my lips were defeated, so a smile failed to form on my face. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that the whites of my knuckles glared through my skin obtrusively. My car wobbled precariously, moving over the white line onto the other part of the road. Suffice to say, a rude driver next to me slammed down his horn angrily. He drove past me with a face like a thundercloud. He waved his finger at me and shouted out of the window, "Watch where you're going, lady! Keep to your bloody lane, will you? You were about to drive me off the road there." "I'm sorry," I said under my breath. Of course he never heard me. I straightened my trajectory on the road, my face growing as white as a lily at my daughter's words.
Kendall, you're scaring me. What do you mean? I asked her. What do you mean Granny Alice visited you last night? You're not making any sense to me at all. What the hell are you talking about? I said, not realizing how snappish I was sounding. I knew my brusque tone of voice had hurt my daughter. I told you, said Kendall, her eyes filling with tears. Granny Alice was standing at the end of my bed last night. I told you that. I wondered why she was in my bedroom, what she was doing there. She said she'd come to say goodbye. She was going away and that I must be good. That's all. Oh, my God, I said, pulling to the side of the road to park my car. Oh, my God. Oh, I feel as if my heart is beating way too fast. I wrestled with my cell phone that was in my purse. It became like butter in my hands and kept slipping through my fingers as I tried desperately to hold it. Fear has a capacity to make your fingers become pretty useless. If that wasn't bad enough, in my hurried frenzy to get through to my mother, I dialed the wrong number twice. My daughter's terrifying words had put the fear of God into every single cell of my body. I had a sense of foreboding, and now my daughter had claimed to see my mother at the end of the bed. That was too much to bear. You only heard stories like that when someone had passed on. My mother was a healthy woman in the prime of life. She was robustly well for a woman in her early 80s. She couldn't be dead, could she? Oh, please, God, no. I trembled as I phoned my mother's number, but her telephone just rang and rang and rang. My mother was always very quick to answer her calls, usually on the second or third ring, but this time her phone calls went straight to voice message. Hello, this is Alice Tomlinson speaking. Please leave a message on the phone, will you? And I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Pick up, Mum, pick up, I kept saying. But again and again I just got connected to her voice message. I knew in that moment that this was what my sense of foreboding was all about. My mother was in trouble. But she's not there, Kendall insisted. I told you, she told me she's gone away. You don't think it means she's dead, do you? Was it her ghost that visited me last night? She asked me. At this point my heart was now thundering in my chest. Kendall, I don't know what it was you saw last night, but it doesn't mean that your grandmother is dead. But I do know your grandmother isn't answering her phone, which is out of character for her. So what we're going to do right now is to go home. I want you to pack a few things into your overnight suitcase. We're going to take a flight to get to Granny's house quicker. Do you think you can do that for me? I'll tell your father we'll go away for a couple of days. I don't know why your grandmother is not picking up her phone. I'm extremely worried about her. We need to make sure she's all right. I'm phoning your father right now, I told her, as I tapped my husband's number in my cell. Hello, sweetheart. Is everything all right? No, I don't think it is. I think something's happened to my mother. Calm down. Where did you get that idea from, sweetheart? I'm sure she's fine. Your mother's in robust health for a woman of her age. She's not picking up her phone. I keep dialing and dialing her number, but she doesn't answer. I'm so worried. And Kendall... I stopped elaborating after mentioning my daughter's name. I decided not to tell my husband about Kendall, seeing my mother at the end of the bed the previous night. I didn't think that would go down very well with my husband Luton, who was a very practical man, who worked with numbers and science, but never believed in anything that could not be physically proved. Outer-worldly things, premonitions, funny feelings and stuff like that would be to his mind hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense, not reliable at all. I'm taking a flight, Luton, just to check on my mother. We'll be gone for a couple of days. Kendall's coming with me. If you feel you must, sweetheart, I think you should take a flight out, if it's going to put your mind at rest. But I am quite sure you're worrying about nothing. I hope you're right, Luton. I really do. But I've a bad feeling in my gut about her. As I say, I think you're worrying about nothing. But you must go to allay your fears. I'll see you at home in a couple of days. Keep me posted. Will do, I said. 3.5 hours later, the flight to South Carolina took over an hour and a half. Driving to my mother's place would have taken well over 10 hours, time that I couldn't afford to waste. I sat in the back of the taxi, holding my daughter's hands tightly, as if I never ever wanted to let go, almost as if Kendall was tethering me to the seat, like a boat in a mooring site. She became my anchor for me, as I trembled at the back of the taxi, terrified of what I would find when I finally got to my mother's house. The taxi driver was a sweet, garrulous man, wearing a turban on his head and one of those long, flowing white cotton smocks over pantaloons. He was chatting away merrily about his life and about how he was marrying off all his children in pre-arranged marriages. I guessed he was from India, Bangladesh perhaps, although I couldn't be sure. "Well, my daughter does not like the man I have chosen for her. But I tell her we know better what is right for her. You know what I mean. I tell her that I did not like her mother when we first got married. But you know, we make it work. And now I love my wife very, very much. I tell my daughter the same will happen for her. She does not believe me. I tell her Western marriage is dreadful. Too many cock-ups. Far too many cock-ups. I told her she will be happy we choose for her, you know. But she think she know better. But we know better for our children." "I'm sure," I said, being as polite as I could. I was counting the minutes to get to my mother's house. The landscape soon became a lot more familiar, so I began holding my breath. I wanted to get into her house as fast as I possibly could, but I didn't at the same time. I was hanging between a rock and a hard place. I was afraid of what awaited me from behind my mother's front door. "Ouch!" said Kendall. "You're squeezing my hand so tightly," she said, giving me an angry glare. "Sorry, sweetheart. I'm nervous, that's all." The taxi drove down a remote, narrow road, covered by an archway of trees. Then it took a swift left-hand turn, and there we were driving through the open gate of what was once our family property. The old rusty sign had almost extinguished the name of the main house, which should have read Copper Showers, but it read something like Op Shower. At that point my heart was thundering in my chest more violently than before. "Take the small narrow road to the right, the one that says Fairfield Cottage," I told the driver obsequiously, in almost a hoarse whisper. "Ah, this one here," said the taxi driver. "That's right," I said. "The main driveway leads to the main house, where I used to live when I was a girl. The small driveway here leads to the cottage where my mother lives." I handed my daughter a wad of cash. "When we stop, pay the driver," I said. "Bring out our suitcases. I'm going to check out on my mother." The taxi driver parked his car outside the white cottage, which looked so pretty and picturesque under the afternoon sun, facing a beguiling meadow, and hugged on the rear side by the lofty, distinguished-looking trees of a wood grove that stretched back for many miles. The little meadow was full of alpine flowers, and my mother's free-range chickens were trotting across the grass, pecking the ground for worms. My mother loved her hens and had names for each and every one of them. She also had a black cat with white paws that she called Socks. I hasten to say her cat was such an incredible nightly predator, bringing my mother nightly surprises as gifts all the time. That cat made my Maine Coon Sainsbury look like an amateur hunter by contrast. When I'd been a girl, we'd lived up at the main house, much further up the driveway. But when me and my brother Angus left home, and after my dad died, my mother sold up the main house and the accompanying sizable land, and moved to the cottage which she agreed to hand over to the residents once she died. It seemed like a great arrangement for all concerned, as my mother was very close to the Barker family, who owned the main property. "Thank you very much," I said to the taxi driver. "My daughter will pay you now." I hurriedly ran towards the cottage. I noticed my mother's Mazda was parked in the carport. There was nothing sinister about the cottage that suggested that anything untoward had happened. But that's exactly what houses are like, aren't they? They're benign, benevolent, don't necessarily betray the horrors that might lie within their midst. I was terrified of what I would ultimately find in the house once I opened the front door. And I did, with the spare key my mother had given me. And the coppery taste of blood hung strongly in the air. And that was when I unequivocally knew that my mother was dead. I called out my mother's name, while my heart just literally walloped in my chest. My airways became so tight, I felt as if I could barely breathe. When I ambled down the passageway, I briefly glanced through the open double doors of the living room. My mother was lying on the ground in a pool of her own blood, and next to her head lay a smashed vase, and a plethora of dead flowers were lying scattered around her, along with the angry, jagged glass shards from the vase. The round table in the living room had been very elegantly laid for tea, with a teapot now cold. There were 3 cups and saucers that contained half-drunk tea. There was a sugar bowl, a small jug of now sour milk, and 3 plates containing cake, lemon meringue pie, and cookies. The lemon meringue pie was just covered with ants. There was a jug of her homemade lemonade on the table, and 3 tumblers. I realized to my horror that someone had clearly enjoyed tea with my mother. Could this person have actually killed her? And if so, why? In my opinion, it did not look like the person had intended to kill her, or why would they have used a vase to hit her on the head with? Would they not have arrived with a weapon, if her death had been intentional? I just dropped to the floor like a floppy rag doll, and burst into tears. "What's happened?" said Kendall, entering the house, her face growing pale, as she saw her grandmother lying there on the ground, motionless. "Don't touch her, sweetheart. This is now a crime scene. I'm sorry, Kendall. Your grandmother, she's dead. She's dead. I can't believe it. She's dead." "But why would anyone hurt Granny Alice? I don't understand." "Good question. I have absolutely no idea, darling. No idea at all. But I will tell you something. Whoever did this is a monster. And I will kill them myself when I find out who did this. Granny Alice was the kindest woman I ever knew. She was my mother, and I loved her, and now she's gone." Before I even contemplated calling the police, I called Philip Barker first. He lived up at the main house. I wanted to tell him the dreadful news, to see if he could make any sense of this insanely senseless tragedy. He was a nice man, who was incredibly fond of my mother. On hearing what had happened, he quickly drove to Alice's cottage as fast as he could, jumping out of his truck. His face was as white as a sheet. He was well built, relatively stocky, a man in his early 40s who worked from home, but had a large stable block of horses and grew many organic vegetables on his property. It was clear he'd been working in the field today, as his trousers were tucked in his boots, and he was wearing a rolled-up plaid shirt. His skin looked quite bronzed, as if he'd acquired a tan from working out of doors, which I thought rather suited him. "I'm so sorry, Carly," he said, throwing his arms around me and giving me a warm bear hug, and then my daughter at the same time. "I have no understanding what has happened here," he said, his eyes scanning my mother's body, with a very bemused look on his face. "I don't know what to say, Carly," he said, shaking his head. "This is completely senseless. Alice is an old woman, for God's sake, but someone whacked her over the head with a vase. If it's any consolation, Carly, not that there is anyone here, I doubt she suffered anything. I imagine she died at once." "Who would do this to my mother?" I asked him, with a desperate pleading look in my eyes. "It has to be someone who knows her," he said. "Someone who she invited into her cottage willingly. There are no signs of a break-in anywhere. Furthermore, a table appears to be set for tea. I suspect the police will be looking for DNA evidence when we call them, so don't you touch a thing. But before they get here, I want to make sense of all of this, figure out who could have done this to Alice. Whoever did this knows this cottage and must know her. I'm certain of it. I don't know if the person intended to kill her. If they had, they would have arrived on the property with a knife or revolver. I think she let someone in, and that individual, whoever they were, became violent. Maybe he didn't even intend to kill Alice. Maybe he or she lashed out at her angrily. But the question is why and who? Your mother could never have harmed a fly. She was one of the most gentle, sincere women I have ever met, with a heart of gold." "What's wrong?" I asked, when Philip suddenly became almost red in the face, after I could see him doing some mental soul-searching.
I was just having a think, that's all. Recently we hired a farmhand to help with our horses, mucking out the stables and things. His name is Seb Carpenter. His grandmother lives in town, tirelessly complains about him. She actually advised me against giving him a job as a farmhand. She waggled her finger at me and said, "Mr. Barker, don't hire my grandson. He's bad news, that boy. Hasn't got a good bone in his body anywhere. You will almost certainly regret it if you do. He's always stealing my money, and he's got quite the temper on him, you know."
I looked at Philip incredulously. "She told you that, and you still hired her grandson. Why would you do that?"
Philip Barker flushed. I know. You can say it. What was I thinking? I should have listened to the old dear. But I reasoned the young man had perhaps never had a chance in his life. I told him what his grandmother had told me. He admitted he was involved in petty theft a couple of years prior, but he insisted that he had changed over a new leaf. He claimed it was now all behind him. He said he had smoked pot, taken recreational drugs, but that was now all in the past. He was looking for someone to give him that chance, to have a little faith in him. I have to say I believed him, Carly. I could see the conviction in his eyes. He seemed determined to put his duplicitous past behind him. I really sensed he meant every word of it. He said to me, "Mr. Barker, you are the first person that has shown any faith in me. I promise I'll never let you down."
"And you think he could have killed my mother?" I asked.
I don't want to bark up the wrong tree, Carly, I really don't. But we did have a great deal of fortuitous challenges, I have to say, when Seb Carpenter started working for us. According to my farmhand Eddie, I was informed that Seb had a bad attitude. Personally, I never found that myself. I thought he was rather upbeat. One day I heard a commotion going on in the stable block. The two farmhands were literally wrestling each other. And I have to say, Seb was pinning down Eddie. I told them to stop this outrageous behaviour at once, or they would both lose their jobs forthwith. I was to find out later that Seb had stolen one of our saddles, according to our farmhand Eddie. He informed me of that when I discovered it was missing. I also was to discover that various other things that I was looking for had suddenly gone walkabout. So I told Seb in no uncertain terms to leave and to never ever come back. Needless to say, he protested his innocence, but I believe Seb was responsible for those thefts. It would seem his attempts to change over a new leaf had gone awry, which is a desperate pity. He's in a relationship with the pastor's daughter, you know, so I really thought she would be a positive influence on Seb, but it seems my impressions are wrong. The pastor thinks Seb is a reformed character. I'm not so sure. I think we see what we want to see when it suits us.
But what has Seb Carpenter got to do with Alice, my mother? Why would he want to hurt her? Does he even know her at all?
Seb approached your grandmother, claiming he'd like to do some casual work so that he could make some money. He told your mother he wanted to buy an engagement ring for the pastor's daughter, Jeanie. He told her that Jeanie had changed his life, knocked the bad boy right out of him. Your mother, well, you know what she was like. Ever optimistic, the perennial romantic, you could say. Well, your mother really did love Seb. She had a soft spot for the young fellow. Wouldn't hear a bad word said against him. But she was upset when he wanted to be paid in advance for a job he hadn't done yet. He told her he couldn't tell her why he needed the money. Your grandmother said to me,
"I love Seb with all my heart. I really do. But I'm sorry. I can't pay him unless he's done the work."
She told me that Seb had been very upset, but he understood. But who knows what was going on in his head at the time? Maybe he was very aggrieved. Things got out of control, perhaps. I'm only speculating, of course. I could be entirely wrong. I mean, what do I really know?
Oh dear, he doesn't sound good, does he? You think he could have done something to Grandma Alice over money or because she simply refused to pay him in advance for a job he hadn't done. That's ludicrous, is it not?
Look, said Mr. Barker, shaking his head. I rue the day I hired Seb, that farmhand, I'm afraid. He was trouble. A dysfunctional youth, you could say, with a plethora of problems behind him. Even my wife didn't like him particularly. She said there was something uncouth and calculating about Seb. If she was here now, she would tell you unequivocally he had done it. Well, she doesn't trust him an inch. But I think my wife has always been influenced by the narrative going around. If she's heard on the grapevine, for example, that someone can't be trusted, she'll believe it fiercely, with no opinion of her own, I have to say. She thinks I'm too complacent and carefree, but she doesn't understand that I do believe people can change, and I rarely thought that Seb had been, well, able to change. But maybe my instincts are not as sharp as I thought they once were. I can see, of course, that I'm not going to live this down. When I tell my wife what has happened, she'll be saying, I told you so. I told you he couldn't be trusted. I bet you he murdered Alice. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.